resolution, including by ending settlement expansion, demolition, incitement, and all actions that undermine prospects for peace. Second, we stress the imperative of compliance with international law and relevant General Assembly actions, including General Assembly Resolution ES 1024 of 18 September 2024, which addressed the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. These resolutions call for an end to action that harms civilians and undermine the two-state solution, and for affirmative steps to reverse negative trends. Third, Security Council resolutions, including recent Resolution 2803, must be implemented in good faith. We underscore the expectations set out in that resolution, including that the ceasefire be respected and strengthened, that civilians be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law, and humanitarian access be fully enabled and unimpeded, that the transitional arrangements lead within a defined time frame a unified and legitimate Palestinian governance over the occupied Palestinian territory. The cessation of hostilities must be consolidated into durable calm and coupled with credible steps to revive a political process that ends the occupation and restores a viable path to peace. Fourth, integral to the credible political process is the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations and the finalization of its statehood. The security of Israel and its full integration in the region must also be safeguarded. The viability of the two-state solution requires that both peoples see a future of hope, dignity, and mutual security. Fifth, the reconstruction of Gaza must also be addressed with urgency and integrity. Gaza's recovery cannot be deferred, nor pursued in ways that entrench displacement or fragmentation. Reconstruction should restore basic services and livelihoods, support the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of civilians consistent with international law, and advance unified and legitimate Palestinian governance within an agreed timeframe. Mr. President, I live with the hope that the Palestinian question will be resolved without further delay. The Security Council and the international community must continue to consolidate efforts to achieve a permanent and complete cessation of hostilities in Gaza and the West Bank, address the humanitarian crisis, and advance a credible political process. The Security Council must remain seized of this matter and act with unity and resolve. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone, and I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. Panama is grateful to Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, for presenting the quarterly report on the implementation of Resolution 2334, which offers a detailed and worrisome stocktaking of the situation on the ground, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Before beginning, I would like to express on behalf of the government and people of Panama our condemnation of the attack that took place in Australia during this Jewish celebration of Hanukkah, a holiday of peace. We would like to send our deepest condolences to the victims of the families whose holidays were marked by terror and extremism. The situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Mr. President, has continued to deteriorate over a long period of time. The most recent figures demonstrate a sustained increase in violence, forced displacement, and demolitions. This year, over 1,000 people have been displaced from Area C due to demolitions, as a result of lack of construction permits that have become practically inaccessible to the Palestinian population. We'd like to reiterate that the protection of the civilian population must be a priority at all times, in line with international law, including international humanitarian law. Mr. President, as far as Gaza, the The ceasefire enforced since October, achieved thanks to the efforts mediation by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, and supported by countries in the region, as well as endorsed by Resolution 2803 adopted by this Council, has allowed for a relative drop in the intensity of hostilities and a certain humanitarian improvement. However, the situation remains fragile. The most recent reports indicate that there are continued civilian victims, destruction of infrastructure persists, and over 90% of the population remains displaced, living in extremely precarious conditions. The humanitarian situation continues to be critical, recently aggravated by severe climate conditions that have led to the collapse of structures that had already been damaged, flooding in medical facilities, and new waves of displacement. Panama values and supports the efforts of the United Nations and its partners to step up assistance, including reopening of healthcare services, provision of food, and support to the displaced population. However, these efforts continue to be inadequate in the face of the scale of the needs. Bearing this in mind, Panama underscores that it is essential to maintain the presence and support of the United Nations and its specialized agencies in this new opportunity for peace in Gaza and the West Bank. We reject any action that affects the inviolability of UN facilities and those of its agencies, and we reiterate that the privileges and immunities of the United Nations must be respected without any exception. Mr. President, the comprehensive recuperation in Gaza requires that Hamas has no role in its future. A sustainable peace, the rebuilding of the Strip, and restoring a dignified living conditions for the civilian population in Gaza are incompatible with the presence of groups that use extremism. The future of Gaza must be under the leadership of reformed Palestinian leadership, a unified one, capable of guaranteeing security for its own population and for its neighbors. Panama reiterates that Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are integral parts of a future Palestinian state, and that the only viable, sustainable, and humane solution will be the one that allows for the people of Israel and Palestine to live side by side in peace, security, and dignity in line with international law and the relevant resolutions of this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the UK.
Thank you, President. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Alak Barov for briefing us today. 2025 has been a year of unimaginable suffering for Palestinian civilians in Gaza, for hostages and their families, and for the wider region. Yet there is cause for renewed hope. Thanks to the tireless diplomatic efforts of the US, Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt, we have a ceasefire. 47 more hostages returned to their families, and a 20-point plan for Gaza offering the chance of a peaceful future for the region. We call on all parties to uphold the ceasefire and fully implement Security Council Resolution 2803. Israel must lift all barriers to aid without delay and let international NGOs operate freely. At least 14 people are reported to have died since last week due to harsh winter conditions and flooding. We need medical supplies, shelter materials, and fuel delivered into Gaza now. UK-funded tents have entered Gaza to provide urgent shelter for families. This provides a lifeline for 12,000 vulnerable civilians. It is also vital that the remains of the final deceased hostage, Ran Gavili, are returned to his family. Hamas must disarm and unequivocally renounce violence. As we build a better future for Gaza, Palestinians must remain at the heart of transitional governance. And amidst progress on Gaza, we must not lose sight of the West Bank. It faces an unprecedented crisis, which risks undermining the 20-point plan and regional peace. So in that context, I'd like to make 3 points. First, this year has witnessed an unprecedented rise in settler violence against Palestinians, with 260 attacks in October alone. We condemn all such attacks. President Herzog and Prime Minister Netanyahu have committed to tackling settler violence. This must translate into concrete actions to protect Palestinian civilians and hold those responsible to account. We were shocked by reports of Israeli authorities entering an UNRWA compound on 8 December without authorization. UN premises are inviolable. Israel must comply with its obligations under international law. UNRWA plays an indispensable role supporting Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and in the region. Second, we reiterate our firm opposition to settlement policies that violate international law and any form of forcible annexation. The reported approval of 19 new settlements in the West Bank, continued evictions of Palestinian families in Silwan in East Jerusalem, and the expropriation of the entire Acropolis of Sebastia and surrounding lands take us further away from peace. Third, the economic situation in the West Bank remains on a cliff edge. We call on Israel urgently to release withheld tax revenues, increase shekel transfer limits, and confirm a longer-term extension for correspondent banking relationships to avert economic collapse. President, the year ahead offers a chance to turn a page on 2 years of tragedy and chart a course towards peace. The UK will work with all our partners to implement Resolution 2803, promote West Bank stability, and develop an irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the UK for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, President. Pakistan joins colleagues in strongly condemning the heinous attack in Sydney at a religious gathering. We extend our deepest condolences to the families of victims and wish a speedy recovery to the injured. Pakistan unequivocally condemns terrorism in all forms and manifestations. We also thank Deputy Special Coordinator Ramiz Al-Akbarov for his sobering briefing. The Palestinian people have endured decades of illegal occupation marked by dispossession and denial of their inalienable rights. Over the past 2 years, this suffering has escalated to an unprecedented scale in Gaza, and more than 70,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed, with communities destroyed and essential systems collapsing. Despite the bleak reality, the international community has sought to preserve the possibility of peace. A high-level conference in July and the General Assembly's endorsement of the New York Declaration established a multilateral pathway to revitalize the two-state solution. And President Trump's leadership and persistent efforts resulted in the peace plan and the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, mobilizing regional and international actors around urgent priorities, namely ending the bloodshed, maintaining the ceasefire, responding to the humanitarian catastrophe, reuniting families with detainees and hostages, and reopening a credible political process towards Palestinian self-determination and statehood. Pakistan acknowledges the facilitation of the United States, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey in this regard. These efforts culminated in the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2803, which Pakistan supported as part of the Group of 8 Arab and Islamic countries engaged in this process and in full alignment with the position of the State of Palestine and the Arab countries. All these efforts reflect a shared recognition that the status quo is untenable and that only a political horizon grounded in international law can offer a way forward. No resolution of the Security Council can be unilaterally declared outdated. They remain relevant and in force until they are implemented. Pakistan's position remains principled and consistent. The Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory must end, and the Palestinian people must be enabled to exercise their inalienable right to self-determination through the establishment of an independent sovereign state of Palestine. President, the role of UNRWA remains crucial and cannot be allowed to be undermined by unwarranted and unfounded criticism. On 12th of December, the foreign ministers of 8 Arab Islamic countries reaffirmed the indispensable role of UNRWA in safeguarding the rights and well-being of Palestinian refugees. The ministers condemned the storming of the UNRWA headquarters in Sheikh Jarrah, neighborhood of East Jerusalem, by Israeli forces, as this attack represents a flagrant violation of international law and the inviolability of UN premises. And it violates the advisory opinion of the ICJ of 22nd October 2025. The Secretary General's latest report on the implementation of Resolution 2334 paints an alarming picture. During the reporting period, Israeli authorities advanced over 6,300 housing units in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, with a significant concentration in Area C and sensitive areas such as E1. It underscores that settlement activity in 2025 has reached the highest levels since the United Nations began systematic tracking. These actions, as reinforced by the July 2024 advisory opinion of the ICJ and identified in Resolution 2334, have no legal validity and are a violation of international law as they continue to entrench the occupation and undermine the viability of the two-state solution. Looking ahead, Pakistan wishes to highlight following points. First, Resolution 2803 must be implemented in full and in good faith. The momentum generated at Sharm el-Sheikh must be sustained. The central role of the Palestinian Authority is indispensable. The second phase must be implemented without delay. Second, all settlement activity must cease immediately in line with Resolution 2334. Any attempt to alter the demographic, legal, or historical character of the occupied territories, including around Al-Haram al-Sharif, is illegal and must be reversed. Third, the ceasefire must be fully respected with no unilateral military actions. The withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza remains essential. Fourth, full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access must be guaranteed. Fifth, reconstruction should begin without delay with no annexation, forced displacement, or fragmentation of the occupied Palestinian land. Sixth, accountability is indispensable, as without justice and respect for international law, there can be no durable peace. And finally, a time-bound and irreversible political process anchored in relevant UN resolutions must lead to the establishment of sovereign, independent, and contiguous state of Palestine on the basis of pre-1967 borders, with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. That is the best guarantee for durable peace in the region. It is high time to turn promises into action and to speed up this process. Pakistan's solidarity with the Palestinian people remains unwavering. We stand firmly with them in their legitimate struggle for dignity, justice, and self-determination, and for the realization of an independent Palestinian state in accordance with international legitimacy. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, at the outset, Guyana condemns the attacks in Sydney during a Hanukkah gathering. We offer our deepest condolences to the families of the victims and to the government and people of Australia. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Alak Baroff for presenting the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. The report confirms again that the provisions of Resolution 2334 continue to be openly violated, infringing on the rights of the Palestinian people and undermining the achievement of the two-state solution. Having examined the report, I wish to highlight 4 elements that are particularly concerning to my delegation. First, Guyana has noticed a growing proclivity by actors on the Israeli side to advance legal measures to extend settlement activity in the occupied West Bank. We have taken note, for example, of the introduction to the Knesset of 2 private bills extending Israeli law to occupied West Bank settlements. Though these bills did not advance beyond preliminary readings nor received government support, it is important to take note of the enabling culture that encourages lawmakers who wish to pursue objectives that collide with Israel's international legal obligations. Guyana therefore urges Israel to abide by its obligations as an occupying power, as stipulated in international law, including its obligation not to annex any of the territory under occupation. We reiterate our appeal for Israel not to further the implementation of the E1 settlement plan, which would further reduce Palestinian territory. We also underscore that the Israeli legislative measures of which I speak continue to come with extremely high costs to Palestinians whose properties are subject to demolitions and seizures, or who face heavy fines for refusing to comply with demolition orders. Second, on the issue of violence against civilians, regrettably, despite the achievement of a ceasefire deal in Gaza, hostilities continue with ongoing airstrikes, shelling, and gunfire. Hundreds of casualties have been recorded since the start of the ceasefire. Our anticipation had been that the ceasefire would have led to the silencing of the guns in Gaza and a flood of humanitarian relief for the ailing population, creating the conditions for recovery and reconstruction. The Secretary General's, as well as other credible reports, however, make it clear that the reality on the ground still requires drastic improvements, especially now that winter conditions have begun and last week's torrential rains, which brought heavy flooding to Gaza. Guyana calls on the parties to the ceasefire agreement to fully comply with the commitments undertaken for the protection of civilians and to advance Gaza's recovery. The full restoration of public law and order throughout the Strip is also important for this objective. Mr. President, while eyes are trained on Gaza, violence against civilians in the occupied West Bank continues unabated and at increasingly alarming levels, with the operation started by the Israeli security forces in January still ongoing. These operations have resulted in numerous fatalities and injuries, loss of property and livelihoods, and led to the forcible displacement of thousands of Palestinians. This Council must take active steps to protect the civilian population in the occupied West Bank and to halt the mounting violence. My third observation concerns the provision in Resolution 2334 for the parties to refrain from provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. The peace we seek in the occupied Palestinian territory can be helped or hindered by messaging, particularly from key figures involved in the conflict or actors with strong influence. Guyana therefore urges responsible messaging on issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in compliance with Resolution 2334. And fourth, the persistent fiscal crisis faced by the Palestinian Authority is in no small measure attributable to Israel's withholding of revenue and the sword of Damocles it consistently hangs over correspondent banking agreements. If the PA and Palestinian institutions are to be strengthened enough to be able to build a viable Palestinian state, a strong economic base is foundational. In this context, member states and international corporations must halt all ongoing trade with illegal settlements, since such trade enables the humanitarian crisis driven by Israel's decades-long occupation. The Security Council should therefore consider how to address this aspect of Resolution 2334. Mr. President, as this is the last mandated meeting on the Palestinian question for 2025, and for Guyana's current term as an elected member of the Council, allow me to offer brief reflections on this file on the Palestinian question. From the very beginning, our conviction was and remains that strong political will is the key ingredient for moving the needle on the question of Palestine. In cases where it is lacking but needed, that political will can be encouraged, and the Council and the United Nations as a whole have ways and means to achieve this. It is our responsibility to combat the impunity with which all the actions directly impeding the resolution of the Palestinian question are carried out. To do anything less would be to consent to entrenched impunity. The comprehensive plan for ending the conflict in Gaza is a positive step in this direction. As we have said before, however, its implementation must be steeped in international law, and safeguarding and promoting the rights of the Palestinian people must be its centerpiece. The sustainability of the peace that emerges from this plan would be determined by how closely it adheres to these two factors, the rule of law and Palestinian rights. The central role of the United Nations on both aspects must be safeguarded, including by upholding the ICJ's advisory opinion on Israel's obligations in relation to the organization. On this note, Guyana strongly condemns Israel's actions against UNRWA's property in East Jerusalem as a flagrant violation of international law, particularly in light of the pronouncements by the ICJ on this matter. I conclude, Mr. President, by appealing to the entire United Nations membership to apply a simple but profound rule of thumb to all actions pertaining to the Palestinian people, and that is, because all people everywhere are born equal, the aspirations we have for our own people should not be different to the aspirations we have for the Palestinian people. For Guyana, that is certainly what has always guided our engagement on the Palestinian question. This will continue to guide us, even as we conclude our tenure on the Security Council, until Palestinians are free, in an independent state, living in peace and security alongside Israel. I thank you.
I thank Guyana for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank the Deputy Special Coordinator Alakbarov for his sobering briefing. At the outset, let me extend Korea's sincere condolence to the victims of the terrorist attack in Sydney, targeting civilians celebrating Hanukkah. Mr. President, Korea's term in Security Council started 2 years ago in the aftermath of the horrible terrorist attack by Hamas and amid the massive military response by Israel. Since then, the Republic of Korea, along with other members of the Council, have strived to establish concrete measures to minimize suffering on ground. We now have a ceasefire in Gaza, thanks to the efforts by the mediating countries, US, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. Yet, our sense of responsibility has not been relieved. As the humanitarian situation remains dire, attacks continue, and winter sets in. For over 2 years, far too many people in Gaza have been killed and maimed. including countless women and children. With the entire strip totally threatened and humanitarian aid still restricted, those living are still experiencing unimaginable daily indignity. Israel has also suffered greatly. Hostages were released, but not all of them returned home alive, and one body is yet to be recovered. We understand that the most atrocious terrorist attacks in Israel's modern history left unforgettable trauma on all Israelis. Mr. President, under this backdrop today, we meet again to discuss the implementation of Resolution 2334, a landmark resolution adopted 9 years ago, reaffirming the principled position of this Council. This resolution clearly provides, quote, that the status quo is not sustainable and that significant steps are urgently needed, end of quote, to stabilize the situation and to reverse negative trend on the ground. Unfortunately, however, harsh reality on the ground contradicts the unequivocal provisions of this Council's resolution. Indeed, contrary to paragraph 1 and 2 of this resolution, Israel has been rigorously expanding its settlements across the West Bank. Paragraph 6 calls for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians. However, we continue to witness unacceptable settler violence. Despite paragraph 7, we also continue to encounter provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric, both by Israeli officials and Palestinian armed groups. It is also concerning that the work of UN agencies, including UNRWA, is being constantly impeded. The forcible entry of Israeli authorities into the UNRWA headquarters last week exemplifies, as its Commissioner General mentioned, blatant disregard of the obligation with regard to the inviolability of all UN premises. Mr. President, it is deeply regrettable that during our Council membership, we could not reverse this negative trend. However, in the same period, we could hear the ever-growing voice of the overwhelming majority of the international community, calling for an urgent transition from war to peace and from confrontation to coexistence. The international conferences on the two-state solution held in July and September were crucial occasions to reconfirm the wide support of the globe for the two-state solution. The adoption of Resolution 2003 last month also demonstrated common determination to bring the war in Gaza to an end and to move forward a new chapter. Mr. President, this meeting is the final mandated meeting on Palestinian question during our term in Security Council. Thus, let me reiterate our basic but most important positions on this vital issue. First, the Republic of Korea supports the two-state solution as the only viable path toward a just and lasting peace in the region. We believe that the establishment of Israeli settlement in the occupied Palestinian territory has no legal validity, and that all settlement activities must cease immediately. Second, settler violence is unjustifiable under any excuse, and perpetrators must be held fully accountable. Any other violent actions, including terrorist attacks by Palestinian armed groups, must also stop. All actors in the region must refrain from provocative actions and rhetoric. Third, Gaza must not return to its previous conditions. both parties must halt military actions and abide by the ceasefire agreement, as reaffirmed in Resolution 2803. Hamas must lay down its weapons, and Israel must withdraw from Gaza, based on the standards, milestones, and timeframes under the Resolution 2803. Humanitarian aid, in cooperation with all UN agencies, must be ensured at scale. The reconstruction and development of Gaza must commence as soon as possible. And the entry of dignified shelter must be prioritized. In this regard, we commend the efforts by the US to implement the details of Resolution 2803, including the composition of the BOP and the deployment of the ISF. Fourth, a genuine process to advance political horizon between Israel and Palestine must resume. The role of the Palestinian Authority as the legitimate representative of Palestinian people should be guaranteed. We support the reform and revitalization of Palestinian Authority and object to any measure that undermines its viability, such as the withholding of tax revenues. These principles have been repeated numerous times. The Republic of Korea sincerely hopes that this Council will soon have meaningful discussions to realize this common aspiration, and will continue to do our part, both within UN and beyond. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank Mr. Ramirez Alakprov, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and the head of the humanitarian section, and we also welcome the Secretary General's report on the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2334 of 2016. The report once again provides a clear and deeply concerning assessment of developments on the ground and underscores the widening gap between the Council's decisions and their implementations. Resolution 2334 is unambiguous. It reaffirms that the establishment of settlement by Israel in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under the international law. Yet, nearly 9 years after its adoption, settlement expansion continues unabated at an unprecedented scale, particularly in the Area C and East Jerusalem. These actions systematically undermine the viability, continuity, and sovereignty of the future Palestinian state and erode the prospects for a negotiated two-state solution. Somalia remains deeply alarmed by the scale and the pace of settlement activity, land confiscations, demolitions, and forced displacement of Palestinians, including women and children. Such practices violate the international humanitarian law and international humanitarian human rights law and risk an amounting to a forcible transfer. This must cease immediately. At the same time, my delegation is gravely concerned by the escalating violence across the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The loss of civilian life and excessive use of force and settler violence against Palestinian civilians and the destruction of homes and infrastructures continue to fuel instability and despair. Civilians must never be targets. All parties must respect their obligations under international law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and accountability. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Palestine, particularly in Gaza Strip, remains catastrophic. While we acknowledge recent steps that led to increased humanitarian access, these measures remain insufficient given the scale of the destruction, displacement, and human suffering. We call for the full, safe, sustained, and embedded delivery of humanitarian assistance, including through all available crossings, and stress the essential role of United Nations and its agencies, particularly UNRWA, in alleviating human suffering. Resolution 2334 also calls for affirmative steps to reverse the negative trends on the ground. This requires more than rhetoric from the Security Council. It requires concrete actions by the occupying power, meaningful accountability for the violations, and consistent international engagement to preserve the political horizon. It also requires the rejection of incitement, inflammatory rhetorics, and all acts of violence, including acts of terror against the civilians. We underscore that the continued failure to implement Resolution 2334 weakens the credibility of the Security Council and sends a dangerous message of impunity. The Council must uphold its responsibility and ensure that its resolutions are respected and fully implemented. To conclude, Mr. President, we call on all parties to demonstrate a genuine political will to halt unilateral actions that undermine peace and to recommit to a credible political process. We further call on Israel to release all withheld revenues it collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. My delegation reiterates its steadfast support for the realization of an independent, sovereign state of Palestine with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital in accordance with international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. Somalia will continue to stand firmly with the people of Palestine in their legitimate struggle for freedom, dignity, and self-determination. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Deputy Special Coordinator, Ramis Alakbarov, for his sobering briefing. Let me start by expressing our full condemnation of attacks against Jewish communities worldwide, including recent attacks in Manchester and Sydney. We condemn in the strongest possible terms all forms of anti-Semitism and hate, intolerance, racism, and xenophobia, including anti-Muslim hatred. Mr. President, a month ago, this Council adopted Security Council Resolution 2803, which constitutes a crucial step towards advancing peace, security, and stability in the region. Building on the 20-point peace plan mediated by the US and regional partners, it provides a renewed impetus for efforts aimed at permanently disarming Hamas and extremist actors as a sine qua non precondition for a sustainable peace and stability in Gaza. It also lays out a path for restoring Palestinian self-determination and achieving a viable two-state solution. We need to step up the implementation of the peace plan so as not to lose the current momentum, and we call on all parties to abide by its provisions fully and in good faith. Turning to the Security Council Resolution 2334, which frames today's discussion, let me outline the following points. Implementing policies that contravene Resolution 2334 lead to rising tensions and instability in the West Bank. They also have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation of international law. They constitute a serious impediment to the creation of contiguous, sovereign, and viable Palestinian state. The construction of additional settlement units and outposts, land confiscation, demolition of Palestinian homes, and displacement of civilian populations all undermine the prospects for peaceful coexistence based on mutual recognition. Against this backdrop, We are deeply alarmed by the sharp surge in settler violence in the West Bank, including attacks targeting Christian communities. We call for the protection of the Palestinian population in the occupied territories, including the Christian communities, and the preservation of the status quo of the holy sites in the old city of Jerusalem. Should the situation in the West Bank continue to unravel, it could further erode the prospect of a two-state solution. Equally concerning is the ongoing economic strangulation faced by the Palestinian communities resulting from withheld tax revenues and constrained financial flows. The economic viability of the West Bank is indispensable, not only for the livelihoods of Palestinians, but for the broader peace process. We therefore call for the immediate release of withheld revenues and for the restoration of a functioning Palestinian financial and banking sector. It is a prerequisite for meaningful self-governance and sustainable recovery. Mr. President, the role of the UN and its agencies, UNRWA in particular, remains central, and the SDICJ recently reaffirmed in its advisory opinion. A few weeks after the overwhelming General Assembly vote reaffirming the agency's mandate, Greece reiterates its full support for UNRWA's essential work. International solidarity and coordinated humanitarian assistance must remain steadfast, especially during winter, to alleviate suffering and uphold human dignity, particularly as harsh winter storms and low temperatures place vulnerable groups at risk in the Gaza Strip. We take heart in the continued and targeted efforts of the UN and its partners to deliver assistance. Such assistance must continue and be allowed to flow without impediments. Equally, we look forward to the convening of the upcoming conference on the reconstruction of Gaza announced by Egypt. Greece is ready to assist. Mr. President, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, the ancient Greek historian Thucydides describes the symbolic resilience of the olive tree. And to us, Greeks, the olive tree carries through the ages the powerful messages of resilience and peace. Extending an olive branch instead of uprooting the tree is in fact an act of wisdom. We remain unwavering in our conviction that the two-state solution is the only viable way to ensure peace, justice, and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. And we call on all parties to summon the political courage needed to advance along the second phase of the 20-point peace plan. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. At the outset, let me join other colleagues in condemning the terror attack in Bondi Beach in Australia. We convey our condolences to the families of the victims as well as to the people and government of Australia. I thank Mr. Alakbarov for presentation of the report mandated by the Security Council Resolution 2334. Colleagues, this is likely the last briefing on Palestinian question during current Council membership of Slovenia. Without a doubt, this is the defining issue of the work of the Security Council in this period, a question that will likely define the future of the international community. And I believe it was also a milestone that defined many of us as diplomats on a professional level as well as on a personal, human level. Albeit with regular violations, ceasefire in Gaza is finally in place, and we continue calling on all parties to maintain it. But peace is nowhere near. Despite the repeated calls for respect of international law, countless and most egregious breaches were committed in Gaza on our watch. Despite not calling it as such, crippling annexation is taking hold in the West Bank. Without redress, we are bound for endless instability, hatred, and extremism. We must never forget the voice of Hind Rajab, the screams of people burned to death after a strike on a tent camp in Rafah, the testimonies of released hostages, the briefings shaking us to our cores as we witness people starving and humanitarian workers being killed while those responsible continue to act with impunity. And we must never forget many Palestinians still in Israeli arbitrary detention, among them many medical staff, including Dr. Abu Safia. Peace is nowhere near. In these 2 years, Slovenia acted with conviction of doing what is right. We were active in this council through initiatives and calls for council meetings, working particularly closely with Algeria and Guyana and other E10 members. We stood up to attacks against UNRWA through shared commitments supported by over 120 member states. We recognized the state of Palestine and offered direct financial support to the Palestinian Authority. We voted for Palestinian membership in the UN. We joined Norway in calling for an ICJ advisory opinion, and we stand in clear support to the ICC. What keeps us up at night are the unspeakable horrors taking place in Gaza, above and below the ground, and often overseen violations in the West Bank, such as demolitions in Bustan, displacements from refugee camps, settlement expansions, rising settler violence, or now building a new wall in the Jordan Valley, and plans to initiate land registration in the West Bank. We strongly condemn the forced entry of Israeli authorities into the UNRWA compound in East Jerusalem, the seizure of property and removal of the UN flag. Such actions violate the inviolability of UN premises and breach international legal obligations, as outlined by the latest ICJ advisory opinion. We call on Israel to fully respect international law and ensure the safety and protection of UN personnel. We express our profound concern over reports of consideration of sanctions against UNRWA and appeal against this step. What keeps us up at night is the amount of work that still needs to be done. The 3 most immediate steps must be to ensure ceasefire holds in line with Resolution 2803, that a pathway to a credible and time-bound political process is established on the basis of the New York Declaration, and that accountability is ensured. As in any other case, the future of Palestine must be discussed with Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority at the table, and with a strong role of this Council. Colleagues, Palestinians have no other land. Israelis have no other neighborhood. And we collectively have no other solution than the one of 2 states, living side by side in peace and security. We simply should do more to prevent history from repeating itself. For now, peace is nowhere near. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, allow me to begin by commending Slovenia for its term on the Council. You have shown determination and courage, and you have been relentless in upholding the principles you pledged to honor, including the very moving statement that you just delivered. The Palestinian people will not forget what you stood for during your time on this council. I also wish to express our gratitude to the other outgoing members. Nothing that the elected members, the E10, have over the past 2 years demonstrated unprecedented leadership in the pursuit of a ceasefire to save lives, to save humanity, and to salvage international law on the path towards just and lasting peace. I will begin with Algeria, the Arab representative on the Council and a country close to the heart of every Palestinian, the country where we declared our independence. And I am proud that I was a young politician, member of the PNC, that was in that session, and I participated in the voting for the declaration of independence of the state of Palestine. And thank Algeria for its unwavering solidarity. Guyana has been among the strongest voices on this council, matching the powers of its words with the courage of its deeds. Sierra Leone has been a steadfast defender of international law, the expression of our shared humanity. And the Republic of Korea has been a consistent advocate for a ceasefire and for peace. All served with commitment to the Charter and the responsibilities of serving on the Council. We welcome the incoming elected members, Bahrain, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Latvia, and Liberia, and look forward to working with them to advance justice, freedom, and peace in the Middle East and beyond. Mr. President, I thank the Deputy Special Coordinator, Zamir Al-Akbarov, for his briefing and relentless efforts on the ground. Through him, we extend our condolences to the United Nations for the UN personnel killed in the line of duty and reaffirm our deep appreciation for the indispensable role of the United Nations under the leadership of the brave, principled Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The International Court of Justice has clearly determined Israel's obligations as the occupying power, including its duty to facilitate humanitarian relief by the United Nations and its agencies, including UNRWA, rather than obstruct their work, continuing to deprive the Palestinian people of life-saving assistance. Israel's response to the ICJ has been to double down on its breaches of the UN Charter and international law. It has violated the inviolability of UN premises by unlawfully seizing UNRWA's compound in occupied East Jerusalem, removing the UN flag, and raising the Israeli flag over it. The compound is now occupied, as is the city in which it stands. We welcome the overwhelming support for the renewal of UNRWA's mandate and for the resolution following up on the ICJ advisory opinion, and we call for this support to be translated into concrete measures, enabling the agency to continue its vital work in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank, and all other fields of operation in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria in support of the Palestine refugees. Mr. President, more than 70,000 Palestinians have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been injured or maimed. Thousands have been detained. An entire population has been displaced and starved. One figure captures the depth of this agony. During the final months of the Israeli onslaught, the number of babies dying on the very same day that they were born in Gaza was 75% higher than before this war on our people began. That is why no one welcomes the ceasefire more than the Palestinian people in Gaza. But Israel has yet to cease fire. Since the 10th of October alone, nearly 400 Palestinians have been killed, including many children, and 1,000 more have been injured. Victims and survivors still await relief. Restrictions in humanitarian aid persist. People are enduring a painful, harsh winter without adequate shelter, spending days and nights in flooded tents, in inhumane conditions for 2 million people, including 1 million children who have already suffered far too much. Mr. President, we welcome the sustained engagement of the U.S. administration, including at the highest level, to support implementation of the ceasefire agreement. In this context, we welcome the visit of the U.S. permanent representative to the region. We also appreciate the efforts of the mediators and other international partners. We welcome the release of Israeli hostages and hope for the prompt return of the body of the last remaining deceased hostage to his family. We call for the immediate release of the thousands of arbitrarily detained Palestinians and condemn the abhorrent, inhumane conditions of their detention. Nearly 100 Palestinians have died in Israeli custody in the last 2 years due to torture, ill treatment, or medical neglect. We also call on Israel to release all withheld Palestinian bodies. Israel has described this practice as barbaric when it concerned Israelis, yet it has cruelly withheld Palestinian bodies for decades. This inhumane practice must end. Families must be able to offer their loved ones dignified burial. We further call on Israel and the international community to facilitate the recovery of thousands of Palestinian bodies still buried under the rubble, the bodies of children, women, and men, of entire families, and to clarify the fate of the disappeared. Palestinian families live amid ruins, often above mass graves, without the means to retrieve or even identify their loved ones. Their anguish is immeasurable. Nothing I could ever say here can convey their pain. Mr. President, as we approach phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement, allow me to reiterate several fundamental principles. Gaza is an integral part of the occupied Palestinian territory and of the State of Palestine as affirmed by this Council. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, constitute a single territorial unit. Their unity, integrity, and status must be preserved and they must be unified under the Palestinian National Authority as affirmed by this Council. Israel must fully and without delay withdraw from the Gaza Strip as affirmed by this Council. This is essential for the success of any international stabilization force. Israel is confessing its aim to transform the yellow line into a border and to partition and annex Gaza, and continues to pursue the forced displacement of its population. This must end. There must be one independent and sovereign Palestinian state, one government, one law, and one legitimate security force across the Palestinian territory. The Palestinian National Authority, the government of the State of Palestine, is always ready to continue carrying its responsibility as it relates to our people and to our land in all components of the land of the State of Palestine, including the Gaza Strip. These principles are fully consistent with three core tenets articulated in President Trump's plan: no forced displacement, no occupation, and no annexation. Let me repeat: no forced displacement, no occupation, and no annexation. These are the words of President Trump. Mr. President, the unprecedented escalation of settler violence terrorizing Palestinian communities must be understood in the context of Israel's continual policy of displacement and replacement of our people. It is inseparable from settlement expansion, which has reached record levels, with more than 47,000 housing units advanced, approved, or tendered in 2025 alone. This violence unfolds alongside home demolitions by the hundreds, destructions of infrastructure, and uprooting of entire communities from northern West Bank refugee camps to the South Hebron Hills, from East Jerusalem to the Jordan Valley. Settler militias acting hand in hand with the occupying army, systematically targeting our people. The objective is clear and unchanging: annexation. It is evident in East Jerusalem, the E1 area, and the Jordan Valley. It aims at destroying the territorial integrity of the Palestinian state, and with it, any chance for a just peace. This objective is openly declared by Israeli leaders and reflected in Knesset legislation, military orders, and daily actions on the ground. These are facts. The Security Council has been clear. Resolution 2334 reaffirming in unequivocal terms the Council's rejection of Israel's illegal settlement activities and annexation attempts, and demanding for their immediate and complete cessation. This resolution must be fully implemented. President Trump has been clear: there must be no annexation. This is also the position of the region and the international community. Israel must halt all settlement activities, reverse its decision to advance 19 new settlements, and ensure that the condemnation of settler violence translates into accountability, especially since such violence could not occur without the support or acquiescence of the occupying forces. The Israeli government is actively provoking escalation in the West Bank, mass extrajudicial killings with over 1,000 Palestinians killed, mass displacement, nearly 40,000 Palestinians displaced in 2 years, widespread arrests, including of children, repeated assaults in communities, unabated incitement and violations of the historic status quo at holy sites, attacks on the Palestinian Authority, and incitement against the Palestinian people and officials, and the theft of our natural and financial resources. These policies are illegal, dangerous, and irresponsible. Israel must end, not entrench, its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, in line with the ICJ's 2024 advisory opinion. This illegal occupation and apartheid must be brought to an end. That opinion also clearly defines the obligations of third states. We call on all countries to comply with those obligations rather than be complicit in colonial policies that violate Palestinian self-determination and undermine all prospects for peace. Mr. President, all civilians deserve protection. All attacks against civilians must be condemned. In this context, we join all of you in condemning the terrorist attack at Bondi Beach, targeting Jews celebrating Hanukkah. Nothing justifies attacks against innocent people because of their faith. Such crimes can never be justified, and they should not be instrumentalized. We reject attempts to link such crimes to the recognition of Palestinian rights or statehood. This is irresponsible. Equally irresponsible is the suggestion that condemning Israelis' crimes somehow justify attacks against Jews. Jews are not responsible for Israel's action. Israel should not use them as shields, and no one should turn them into scapegoats. We reject any attempt to associate any religion with the crimes of state or non-state actors or individuals, whether Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. Many Jewish and Israeli voices have courageously denounced the genocide against the Palestinian people. This conflict is political, not religious. Nothing justifies anti-Semitism. Nothing justifies racism. Nothing justifies terrorism. Nothing justifies atrocities. All civilians must be protected without distinction. This is what humanity, legality, and morality demand, and the Palestinian people are not the exception. We extend our condolences to the families of the victims and to the government and people of Australia. Mr. President, neither the ceasefire in Gaza nor de-escalation in the West Bank can be sustained without the international community upholding the rule of law and its own obligations. The New York Declaration has charted a clear path forward. The Palestinian people are entitled to freedom, dignity, security, and full respect for their rights. The region yearns for shared peace, shared security, and shared prosperity. Enough suffering, enough killing, enough agony. President Trump's efforts have generated desperately needed momentum to stop mass killing and save lives. The ceasefire must be upheld. It has to become permanent. Illegal unilateral measures must be stopped. The illusion that violence and colonization being security must be abandoned. Shared peace, security, and prosperity in line with international law must be pursued without delay. No forced displacement, no occupation, no annexation. The path to a just and lasting peace is known. It is enshrined in UN resolutions. It must now become a reality for the benefit of all, and I thank you very much, Mr. President and dear colleagues.
I thank the permanent observer of the observer state of Palestine for the statement and for the kind words addressed to my delegation as well as to delegations of outgoing members. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Mr. Alakbarov for his briefing and his work on the ground. On Sunday, the 14th of December, the first night of Hanukkah, a terrorist attack took place at the iconic Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia. At 6:47 p.m. local time, two terrorists opened fire on Jewish people gathered to celebrate. Among the victims were a rabbi, a 10-year-old child, a Holocaust survivor. 3 generations targeted by the same hatred and terror. Those killed also included an 82-year-old woman from Slovakia and a 27-year-old Jewish engineer from France. This grief does not belong to one community or one country alone. It reaches into nations represented in this chamber today. It reminds us that hatred and terror, once unleashed, do not stop at borders. In the midst of that horror, there was also courage. A Muslim, father of 2, Ahmad al-Ahmad, rushed forward, stopped one of the terrorists and wrestled the weapon from his hands. His actions saved lives. They showed what moral courage looks like when it matters most. This attack did not come out of nowhere. From the steps of the Opera House to the arches of the Harbor Bridge, incitement was visible. Hate was normalized. Inflammatory slogans were dismissed. When calls to globalize the Intifada are shouted openly, also here in the city of New York, when hate speech is tolerated and when lies and media distortion are allowed to prevail, violence does not stay theoretical. Jew hatred festers. Extremists are emboldened. Let this attack be a wake-up call, not just for Australia and its government, but for every country represented here. When words of hate are left unchecked, terror does not retreat, it advances. Israel remains committed to confronting terror wherever it appears. We will not look away, we will not be silent, we are not afraid. We stand with the Australian Jewish community and all those who refuse to accept hatred, lies, and violence as the new normal. Hanukkah is a festival of light. It reminds us that even a small light can push back great darkness. We will never dim our light. Mr. President, as the year draws to a close, people around the world begin to reflect. They take stock of what worked, what failed, and what they want to do differently in the year ahead. That is why at this time of year, people set New Year's resolutions, not just to declare intention, but to change outcomes. That is the spirit in which Israel comes before this council today. Looking back over the past year, it is clear what worked for our region and what did not. What worked was a decisive leadership and moral clarity shown by Israel and its allies, especially the United States. Sustained diplomatic and military pressure delivered real ceasefires and created leverage for change. What did not work was hypocrisy and imbalance, obsessive debates over Israel's right to defend itself here in the Security Council, political theater in the General Assembly, the weaponization of the ICC and the ICJ did not advance peace or improve humanitarian outcomes. Across our region and beyond it, the lesson is clear. Anti-Semitic hate fuels terror, and terror spreads when it is excused. So today, Israel is putting forward 5 New Year's resolutions for the Security Council to support a new regional reality: no terror, greater accountability, and deeper cooperation across the Middle East. The first resolution takes us to Gaza. 2 things must happen immediately. First, the last fallen hostage in Hamas captivity, Ran Gvili, must be returned. Second, Hamas must be disarmed. 2025 saw Israel achieve what many said was impossible. All living hostages are home now for Hanukkah. Many of our fallen hostages have been returned and given the dignity of a proper burial, but our struggle is not over. Hamas continues to hold the remains of one fallen hostage, Sergeant Major Ran Gvili. Last week, I met with his family in Israel. I saw their pain, but I also saw their strength and resilience. They are not asking for statements or sympathy. They are asking for dignity, for their son to be returned home for a proper burial. The reality is this: we know, we have the intel, that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they know where Ran Gvili's remains are, and we showed it to the mediators. They can recover and return them. They deliberately choose not to. They choose to violate the ceasefire. This Council itself has recognized the path forward when it endorsed President Trump's peace plan. But progress cannot be made while Ran Gvili remains in Gaza. It cannot move forward while Hamas remains armed. There is no future to Gaza while a terrorist organization controls it. You cannot rebuild a society while terror dictates daily life. This is not just an Israeli demand. It is a regional necessity. Hamas must be disarmed fully and permanently. From Gaza to Lebanon. I know many of you visited Lebanon a few weeks ago. You met officials there. But the pattern is the same: terror-armed, terror-funded, and terror-protected. Resolution 2 confronts the source, Iranian-backed terror. We see it in Lebanon, where Hezbollah's weapons are not defensive. They are supplied, trained, and directed by Iran. And in Lebanon, you spoke with the leadership. Lebanon lives with a contradiction: a government that seeks stability while a terrorist militia operates with impunity. Israel does not seek conflict with Lebanon. We seek a different future. Recent engagement between Israeli and Lebanese officials shows what becomes possible when Hezbollah is weakened: economic cooperation and growth. But as long as Hezbollah remains armed, Lebanon cannot prosper. Ceasefire commitments must be honored. UN resolutions must be enforced. Dismantling Hezbollah's terror network is not about Israel. It is about Lebanon, its territory, its people, and its future. Hamas and Hezbollah are terrorist organizations. This Council cannot tackle terror while refusing to name it. Designation is not symbolic. It is a prerequisite for peace. So I hope that now it is about time in 2026 for the Security Council to do what it has so far failed to do and formally designate Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist organizations. We have seen the cost of delay. The result is bloodshed. This Council must confront terror and radicalization wherever they appear, from Bondi Beach to Beirut to Gaza. That brings us to Resolution 3, the PA, the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, and the reforms it can no longer delay. Over the past year, Israel has presented this Council with clear evidence that the PA is not doing what it needs to do. It has failed to crack down on terror. It has not held elections, I think, in more than 20 years. It continues to incentivize and glorify violence instead of stopping it. You cannot build peace while paying for violence. You cannot fight terror while teaching hate. This Council should be clear about its expectations and firm in enforcing them. That is also true in Syria, the subject of our fourth New Year's resolution. Syria stands at a moment of choice. President al-Shara promises a new future for Syria, but this Council has learned that words alone are not enough. Legitimacy must be earned through actions. If Syria's leadership seeks acceptance, it must break clearly from the repression that stained its past. That means removing radical and extremist elements from positions of power, ending persecution, and protecting minorities. Our final New Year's resolution looks into the future of the region as a whole and the great hopes we have for it. The Abraham Accords prove that when countries choose pragmatism over rejectionism, the results are real. Normalization brought cooperation in trade, technology, agriculture, and security. The international community should encourage further normalization, deepen existing partnerships, support regional frameworks that reward cooperation rather than extremism. Mr. President, the 5 New Year's resolutions I have set out today are about a different future for our region, a future where terror is confronted, not excused, where anti-Semitic hatred is challenged, not tolerated. Distinguished members, as the New Year approaches, people everywhere think about their New Year's resolution. What worked, what failed, what must change. Our New Year's resolutions for the Security Council in 2026 are clear. Hamas disarmed in Gaza, Iranian-backed terrorist proxies dismantled, a Palestinian Authority that stops rewarding terror, a Syria that protects its people, and a Middle East defined by cooperation and peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I will now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.